Alright, welcome everybody to this Lightroom Classic tutorial. This is going to be a beginner's tutorial. I'm going to cover some of the basic adjustments in Adobe Lightroom, and we're going to go from here to here. As you can see, the original image is very underexposed, and this is because I shot this photo with -1 exposure compensation. I usually leave my camera on that just because you can always recover more detail and data out of the shadows than you can the highlights, and I use it to avoid overexposed highlights. However, in this situation, the scene was pretty evenly lit overall, so I don't think I needed it. But regardless, the Sony a7R III, which is the camera I shot this with, has incredible dynamic range, so I know that I'll be able to pull some data out of these shadows and expose this image correctly in post. So let's get started. So I'm going to reset everything. And the first thing I always do on any image is address the highlights and shadows. And as you can see, once again, we are very underexposed. So I'll take the shadow slider, which is basically the darks of the image, and I will raise it. And as you can see, that we're getting a lot of that data back. And I go all the way to 100 and it's still not exposed correctly, but we'll fix that here in a second with the exposure slider. So actually I want to drag the shadows to about, let's say 70. And then I'm going to take the highlights down. The highlights are pretty much the brightest parts of the image, in the sky, clouds, and there's some highlights on these rocks right here. And I usually take these down, and as you can see, they're going to go, and we won't go that far, but we're going to get some data back. So we've gone from there to here, and that's just from the highlights and shadow sliders. And once again, as I said earlier, I shot this with -1 exposure compensation. So I'm going to take the exposure slider and we're going to drag that up to about a full stop at least. And that will get us back to a correctly exposed image overall. And as you can see, when I did that, these highlights, some of them have become blown out. So to compensate for that, I'm going to pull my highlights down a little bit more to bring those back. So yeah, you can see just from those 3 simple adjustments, it makes a world of difference. So if you have underexposed photos and you shot them with a good camera with good dynamic range, more than likely you're probably going to be able to salvage the image. So the next thing I do is I'll mess around a little bit with the whites and the blacks. This is another way you can put contrast in your image as well. And for this image, I'm probably going to raise the whites just a little bit, and you can see what that's doing as I move it back. And I'll make it just a little bit brighter and pop more. So I'll probably raise the whites to about 30. The black slider is basically the darkest parts of your image, so down here in the trees, down here on the bottom left corner, and all the other dark spots over here. And if I move this, you can see what that's doing. I usually go down with the blacks just to create a little more depth in the shadows. But I don't want to go too far, because if you go too far, it's going to look really crunchy and too contrasty, and I don't like that. So we'll reset it, and I'll go just a little bit. -8 seems okay. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little bit of contrast. I usually add contrast in Photoshop after Lightroom to my images, but I will add a touch in Lightroom. And I usually go just about, that's a little too much, about +7. Clarity is another thing that I use often, but you can really go overboard with clarity. So what I like to do is I'll move it back and forth just so you guys can see what it does. If you go negative, it'll give your image like this soft look. Some people will call it like an Orton effect. I usually do all my Orton effect in Photoshop as well, but I will give it a little clarity boost, and it just makes the image more crisp, sort of very similar to sharpening. But like I said, I go very, very little. I'll probably go +4 on this image. Dehaze is another thing that I use a lot. I especially use it in the clouds, but I do it more with selective adjustments, which I will show you here shortly. Vibrance and saturation are two more tools that are very useful. Vibrance, I like to call it smart saturation. Basically what vibrance does is it saturates the least saturated colors. So you can see when I up the vibrance, it makes all the colors more colorful. And if I move it to the negative side, it takes color out. This is another thing that I like to use sparingly, and I like to use it more selectively in Photoshop or in Lightroom with selective adjustments. But I'll give the image an overall vibrance boost. I'll go to about +7 or 8. Seems about okay. This is another thing you can go overboard with. Saturation is basically the intensity of all the colors, and you can see when I move that up and down, it just makes all the colors, especially the greens in this image, it makes them just way more vibrant, and you can go really overboard with this. And I see a lot of photos where people have just cranked the saturation, and in my opinion, to each their own, it just doesn't look good. Sometimes I'll even desaturate. If I think the greens are too much, I'll even desaturate it. Now, this slider right here is the overall saturation of the image. You can actually go down here and adjust the saturation of each color, but I'm going to save that for another tutorial. So I'll take the saturation back to 0, and I'll move it up just slightly to give the greens a little better pop. So we've gone from this before, which is very underexposed, to this after. Another thing I'll do on all my images is I'll go down and I will remove chromatic aberration, and I'll enable profile corrections. And when you enable profile corrections, it basically, with my Sony camera, it knows what lens I use, the 16 to 35 GM lens, and it'll correct the distortion, the vignette in the corners of the images. If I click that off, you'll be able to see how it corrects the distortion. It's really handy. Sometimes I like to look better with it not clicked on, but in most cases I will enable profile corrections, just depending on the image. Another thing I like to do is up here in profile, it gives you, its default set is Adobe Color, and these are basically just color profiles. Adobe Landscape is a good one, and basically the color profiles, it's just more, has a little bit more saturation in the colors. As you can see when I toggle this back to Adobe Color, it's a little more, just gives a little bit more pop. So there's before and there's after. This image looks a little bit cool. So we got the white balance slider up here, and I will almost always in all my images warm it up just a little bit, because the good thing about shooting in RAW is you can always adjust the white balance afterwards. If you didn't get it quite right in camera, or your auto white balance just didn't work quite right in camera, you can always go back and you can set the white balance to whatever you think looks right, or whatever your personal tastes are. I usually warm it up just a little bit. So with all of our adjustments, we went from this, which is underexposed, to this. One more thing I will show you is we have, looks to be almost blown out highlights, and you can definitely tell on the histogram in the right hand corner that these highlights right here are blown out. So what we can do is we can do a selective adjustment, and I would usually do this more, if I had more time I would do this very, very carefully, but I'm just going to do it very quickly to show you guys. So up here in the top right hand corner, you're going to see this little brush icon, and if you click that, you can actually paint on where you want an adjustment. So your brush will come up, and you can use the bracket keys to make it smaller or bigger. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to just brush the sky up here, and put that back to 0. I'm going to brush the sky where all these clouds are. And like I said, I'm not going to be too selective here. If I get a little bit into the mountain, it's going to be okay. However, if I was actually editing this image to put in my portfolio or to print, I would probably use Photoshop for this, but you can do it in Lightroom. So now I brushed. You can't see where I brushed, but if you actually hit O on your keyboard, it enters rugolith mode and it will put red wherever you brush. See, now I can see where I've actually brushed. So I'm going to make my brush a little bit smaller and get in this area right here that I missed. Right here. And yeah, that'll be good enough for the example. So if you hit O again, it'll remove it. And now that I have this area selected, what I can do is I can pull my highlights down even more. But this time, instead of affecting the whole image, it's only going to affect the sky, which is what I want. And when I lower my highlights, you can see up here on the right-hand side of my histogram, my highlights are no longer blown out. And another thing I like to do with my skies, just to bring out more detail, as I said earlier in the tutorial, the dehaze slider. When you up the dehaze for sky, it will bring out more detail and put a little bit more contrast in your sky. See, you can crank it all the way what it does, and that's way too much, obviously. But what I'll do is with the sky selected, I'll just put about 10 dehaze. So now if I go down here to this little icon, we can go before the selective adjustment and then after. So now we got a little bit more contrast and the sky is no longer blown out. I think I went a little bit too far on the highlights there. I'm going to pull those up just a little bit. You can also do things like warm the sky up, cool it off, whatever your personal tastes are. So I think that looks good. So I'm going to close that. And yeah, I think this image, compared to where it was, looks very good. Now, there's tons of things that I would do to this image. Like for instance, this grass down here, up here, I would remove that because I think that's very distracting. I would also do dodging and burning, but I'm going to save all of that for another tutorial. So if you enjoyed this Lightroom tutorial, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. And also follow me on Instagram. I post a lot of my photos on there. And if you like this image, a lot of my images are very similar to this. I do a lot of landscape and cityscape photography. I'll put my handle up here on the YouTube video.